Wade, would you lead a prayer for us in a minute? Thank you. So we are going to get started today. Thank you for being here. We are on page 21 of the lesson book. We're actually a week behind already, and I'm going to try to get back on track to what the initial schedule was over the next 2 to 3 weeks. We'll be breaking things up a bit. So we'll be talking about Jesus' teachings concerning righteousness. Now, we've already talked. The entire sermon pertains to the topic of righteousness in one way or another. So today we're really going to see Jesus defining true righteousness as it relates to the attitudes of the heart and the application of that to ourselves. Before we get started, though, Wade has agreed to lead us in a word of prayer. Amen. So a week ago on Saturday night, I lost my voice, and then this week it kind of developed into, I guess, a sinus infection. So I feel like I'm on the mend, but I've got a lot of stuff going through my head. So I'm going to ask you, as I did last week, to please be vocal. I'll ask you to read. I'll ask you to pick up the slack where I'm struggling a little bit with my voice. So thank you for your patience with me in that regard. Can anyone remind us the framework for our study? What are really the 3 objectives we have in our study? Remember?
Motivation, mediation, activation, verbalization.
Okay, yeah. So that relates. There's really something maybe even higher level than that we're talking about, and that is that we want to be able to know the way, go the way, and show the way, which really just means our objectives are to understand what Jesus says, to make sure we're applying it properly to ourselves and our lives, and to really better prepare ourselves to teach God's word to other people. And so what Sean was just alluding to is really what we've learned already in terms of the topics, or the not so much the topics, but why is it that Jesus is teaching this sermon? Why does Matthew record this for us? Well, it's because Jesus is really helping us see what true righteousness is all about. And that true righteousness has to do with the way that we think about things. That means our disposition as well as the things we meditate upon. It has to do with the words that we speak. It has to do with the things that we're actually doing and taking action on in our lives. And so what priorities are we setting? And so we've been thinking about that so far in terms of how that is a part of the gospel, the good news of the kingdom. The good news of the kingdom has to do with Jesus coming into the world, and Jesus, we're going to notice today in our study, right at the beginning, how Jesus fulfilled the old law. And when we think about fulfilling the law and the prophets, I'm going to propose to you that it's not just that he fulfilled the Old Testament prophecies about the Messiah, but he truly put God's law in place in his life. He completely fulfilled what God would have him to do in terms of God's purpose, not just outwardly, but inwardly. His complete devotion was to the things of God. And so the gospel of the kingdom pertains to various character traits that Jesus teaches, and those we often call the Beatitudes. And we talked then last week about how those people who are part of the kingdom, who have the opportunity to inherit the kingdom, they not only demonstrate those character traits, but in doing so, they let the light shine. And we talked a little bit, well, not a little bit, we talked quite a bit last week about how we get to make that choice, and Jesus really expects us to make that choice, that we are to let our light shine. We are to be outwardly focused in the sense that we are seeking to influence others for good. We're seeking to help others to appreciate the gospel of the kingdom and to be a part of that kingdom. And so it's about the decision to live the way God wants us to live, not just because we think we're going to be punished if we don't do that, but because we want to honor God, we want to glorify Him, we want to be a good influence on others. And so today, we're going to talk about specifically what Jesus says in verses 17 and following about true righteousness. We will see His application of this principle regarding anger. We will also see the application of this principle as it regards to commitments. And in particular today, we're going to focus on the idea of lustful intent. And then my intention is, assuming we can get through all that today, we're going to turn our attention to marriage and that relationship next week and some of the other details that we see in the next lesson. So hopefully we'll get through all of this today. So let's think about true righteousness as Jesus defines it. And could I get a volunteer to read verses 17 through 20 for us? Go ahead.
I think that I came to abolish the law or the prophets. I did not come to abolish, but to fulfill. For truly I say to you, until heaven and earth pass away, not the smallest letter or stroke shall pass from the law until all is accomplished. Whoever then annuls one of the least of these commandments and teaches others to do the same shall be called least in the kingdom of heaven. But whoever keeps and teaches them, he shall be called great in the kingdom of heaven. For I say to you that unless your righteousness surpasses that of the scribes and Pharisees, you will not enter the kingdom of heaven.
All right, thank you, Ben. So I had those up on the slide, forgot about that. So let's think about greatness, greatness in the kingdom as Jesus defines it. As we think about what it means to be great in the kingdom, and that last verse talks about those who will not enter the kingdom of heaven, but in verse 19 says the person who does and teaches these things will be called great in the kingdom of heaven. Well, that goes back to what Jesus got through saying, which is that we are to recognize Jesus as the one who fulfilled the law and the prophets. I've sort of alluded to this already just a few minutes ago, but when you think about this idea of fulfillment, in what ways did Jesus fulfill the law and the prophets? How did Jesus do that? Okay, so the way he lived, he didn't violate the law of God in any way, did he? What else? That's right. Many prophets made of the Messiah. Jesus fulfilled all of the way he lived his life, even things that were beyond his control, where he was born and to whom he was born, and all of those things. Jesus was the fulfillment of those prophetic statements made about the Messiah.
Ultimately, he completed its mission.
Yeah.
In his life and the ending of his life.
Yeah.
Where it was truly put past. I mean, it was now fulfilled.
Yeah, absolutely. Absolutely. And how does that then compare to the righteousness of the scribes and Pharisees? What's the difference between the way Jesus fulfilled the law and what Jesus is saying here about the scribes and the Pharisees? Jimmy?
He set the standard
Okay.
of what they should have been doing.
Yeah. Yeah, absolutely. He certainly set that standard. Excuse me.
John starts off because he says, I am the Word, or it relates Jesus to the Word, which is
Yeah.
the law. So basically, tag on what Jamie was saying. I mean, he is the standard, he's the Word.
Yep.
That's what he is, he came to fulfill it.
When we think about what the scribes and Pharisees, the standards they held people to, and as we're going to see in these next few verses, what's the difference? Stephen, what's on your mind?
Pharisees were really not only, they were demanding that the law be kept.
Right.
However, they were also creating their own law and then binding that on others, but not binding it on themselves. So they were hypocritical, but also binding things outside of what the law would require.
Right. Absolutely. And was that more outwardly focused, do you think, or inwardly focused? Outward, right? It was totally outward. Their hearts were corrupt, but they viewed themselves as righteous because of their outward obedience to some code or standard that they had established. So what I would hope, if you forget most everything else we talk about today, what I hope you'll remember is that Jesus is really concerned about the condition of the heart of those who would follow him. His lesson, as we've already seen in our previous lessons, has everything to do with the way men think and behave. Remember, our disposition, our priorities, our meditation, the things that we're considering, the things that we're saying. Jesus is very concerned about those things. And so, excuse me, so as we're thinking about doing and teaching God's will accurately and completely, that is what makes one great. Not just an outward obedience to some code, but that we are truly, from the heart, seeking the way of God. So when we sum all that up, if all those words we just saw on that previous screen, we put it into one word that Jesus uses, I would submit to you that that's what Jesus means when he says righteousness. True righteousness is that. It is focused on, from the heart, truly submitting to the will of God, truly choosing God's will over oneself. And so we're going to see then Jesus applying that, excuse me, Jesus applying that to anger, and in particular unrestrained anger, as we're going to see in the next few verses. Before we do that, does anyone have any comments about what we just read, talked about regarding verses 17 through 20? Paul?
As I was reading those verses, I was reminded of Ezra. Ezra chapter 7, verse 10, it says that Ezra prepared his heart to seek the law of the Lord and to do it, and to teach the ordinances in Israel. So, I mean, you see, like, the example of his leadership and how, like, when he prayed for the people in their sin, it was we have committed these sins,
Yeah.
right? And you contrast that with the Pharisees and their leadership in Jesus' time, right? They did not take ownership of the sins of the people they were leading. It was very different. It was very much a heart thing for Ezra, and so I kind of see that, Jesus was trying to teach that heart.
Yeah.
I thought that was pretty cool. That it matches very well with that.
Yeah, that's a really, really great point. Thanks for bringing that up. Alex?
This might be a lot more than what you have time to talk about, but I got in a debate with a coworker about these verses, and he argued that we should still follow the old law based
Mhm.
on this verse or
Right.
this group of verses. So we got in a whole debate of when is the law accomplished and when was it not. If we just want to leave that for later, we can, but that's a big conversation.
It is. It is a big conversation. And I think that, as with many other difficult conversations, it comes from a fuller understanding of what we read regarding the old law and how, like such as in the book of Hebrews, that we see that Christians, those who are followers of Christ, were not obliged to do all of these things. As a matter of fact, the blood of bulls and goats were not sufficient to take away sins. And so there's a lot of other passages that pertain to that, that certainly we could study offhand if you'd like in a different setting. But just generally speaking, does anyone else have any thoughts or comments related to how this particular passage relates to the keeping of the law of Moses? We're actually going to see some of that in the next part of our study. But any thoughts on that, Chuck?
I was just going to say, like verse 18, I always think about the way it states there. Like what we would say today is he dotted every I and crossed every T.
Mm-hmm.
I think that, sometimes we overlook the small things. And I think, like, somebody can say, well, I haven't murdered anybody, I haven't cheated on my wife, but it's not about that. It's like what you were saying, it's about righteousness, it's about your heart.
Yeah. Yeah.
It's not so much the big thing.
Well, and you're pointing out a passage that has come to my mind in the past, Alex, when I've thought about these kinds of conversations. It's such, well, he says, not one jot or tittle will pass until all is fulfilled. And it's like, well, okay, what does that really mean? What's that pointing to? And as I've understood that teaching, and excuse me, especially as I compare it to what we read like in the book of Hebrews, I think about how Jesus did fulfill all of these things pertaining to the old law. It served a purpose, and as a matter of fact, it was never for all people everywhere anyway. The law of Moses was intended for one particular people, the Jewish people, for a particular period of time, and it all pointed to Jesus, it all pointed to the Messiah. We're actually going to see some of that in the next little section, but any other comments on that? That's a really good topic.
The idea, I did not come to abolish, but to fulfill, may just be an ellipsis, not to merely abolish, but to fulfill it, to accomplish it. And just going back to what Alex said in Galatians chapter 3, verse 25, now that faith has come, we are no longer under a tutor. So the law accomplished what it was designed to do, to bring the Jews to understanding of Jesus. And so just understanding that, I think, will help out when you're having those conversations.
Yeah.
That he has accomplished what he came to do and fulfilled all that.
Well, and I always have found it helpful. I say always, like I've always done this. I haven't, but certainly I've learned through a lot of error that one of the most helpful responses when you're finding yourself in a conversation like this is just to ask questions. Ask them to demonstrate the basis for what they believe and make sure they have a good understanding of what they believe about something like this. When I think about the idea of the fulfillment of the law and the prophets, think about the destruction of it, one of the questions that comes to my mind that I'd be interested in asking anyone who believes that we need to obey the law of Moses is, well, if I was alive in the days of Jesus, would I have been subject to the law of Moses? I wouldn't have been. I'm not a Jew, right? I wouldn't have been. So at what point did I become obligated to the law of Moses? Under what standard? Let's think about that as we get into this next section. So in the next section, I'm going to have someone just read verse 21 for us. Do you mind? Somebody volunteer? Chuck, do you want to? Just verse 21.
You have heard that it was said, to those alone, you shall not murder, that whoever murders will be in danger of the judgment.
Okay, so let's focus on this term, you've heard that it was said. There's some questions in the book. I think question number 4 has to do with this. It's a good place to put notes for those of you who may not have been in this class in previous weeks. The workbooks are for your benefit in whatever way you find benefit in them. If you just simply want to take notes in class in the workbook, that's a great use of the workbook. If you want to use them in your preparation for class, that's a good use of the workbook. If you want to use it in reflecting on things we talked about in class, that's a great use of the workbook. But it's really just there for your benefit. So when we think about question 4, you've heard it was said to those of old, or you've heard it was said, what are some things, excuse me, what are some things that phrase means to you? What does that phrase indicate in terms of what Jesus is about to say? Okay, all right. So teach above an authority of what was written. Was it just the law of Moses, do you think, that he's saying, he's alluding to when he says you've heard it was said? Whose righteousness is he comparing to in this passage? I heard somebody whisper it. The scribes, the Pharisees, right? Were the scribes and Pharisees only holding people accountable to the law of Moses? No, and so we're going to see some allusions to the law of Moses for sure. As a matter of fact, this first phrase is exactly that. It is from the law of Moses, and we're going to notice that. But I don't want us to forget that Jesus here isn't saying there's something wrong with the law of Moses in the fact that God made an error in some way or something like that. He's not saying that at all. Jesus is simply saying that God cares about men's motives and that God desires the full devotion of men. And Jesus then is going to correct some perversions that have persisted, especially among the scribes and Pharisees, those Jewish leaders, in which they're misapplying the law of Moses. They're adding to that law. They are outwardly trying to show themselves to be righteous, but in truth, in heart, they're not truly committed to the ways of God. And so you've heard it was said, I'm understanding that, and if you have different thoughts on this, I'm very happy to hear this. I'm really understanding that to indicate that Jesus is contrasting what he's going to say with what the scribes and Pharisees would say. What is it that you've heard? Well, this is what you've heard. Here's what I have to say about it. So he's going to now talk about God's attitude towards murder. And so what Chuck read for us, you shall not commit murder, or you shall not murder, and whoever murders will be in danger of the judgment. Certainly we can see passages in the Old Testament in which murder is specifically condemned. Cain was cursed for killing Abel in Genesis chapter 4. In Genesis chapter 9, God told Noah that the punishment for murder would be the loss of the murderer's life. In Exodus chapter 20 and verse 13, God told Israel not to murder in the Ten Commandments. And he also provided specific instructions and standards regarding how murderers should be judged by the people in Numbers chapter 35. And those passages really help us realize that murder was a big deal under the law of Moses. People would lose their lives if they murdered someone else. So then, as we think about what Jesus is teaching about this topic, they already knew it was wrong to commit murder. They already knew that the death penalty is what God had ordained regarding punishment of a murderer, right? They knew those things. So what's Jesus now going to focus on? Well, let's think about this idea of motivation. So I alluded to Cain just a moment ago in Genesis chapter 4. Who would read verses 5 and 6 for us? It's up on the screen or out of your Bible. Ryan, go ahead.
But for Cain and his offering he had no regard. So Cain was very angry, and his face fell. The Lord said to Cain, "Why are you angry? And why has your face fallen?"
What was the condition of Cain's heart when he murdered Abel? Jealousy. What else? A hard heart. What's that? Rebellious. Okay. Notice this. Cain was very angry. Cain was very angry. What about Genesis chapter 37? Who would read verses 4 and 8? I'm just putting select verses up here for the sake of our time, but would somebody read those two verses for us, Stephen?
But when his brothers saw that their father loved him more than all his brothers, they hated him and could not speak peacefully to him. His brothers said to him, "Are you indeed to reign over us? Or are you indeed to rule over us?" So they hated him even more for his dreams and for his words.
What's the condition here of Joseph's brothers as they're hearing him talk about these dreams he's had? Hatred. Jealousy. Could you say anger as well? I think so. What about 1 Samuel 18? I heard somebody over here volunteer. Was that you? Go ahead, Kendall.
And Saul was very angry, and this saying displeased him. He said, "They have ascribed to David 10,000s, and to me they have ascribed thousands. And what more can he have but the kingdom?" And Saul eyed David from that day on.
What emotion was Saul feeling in these verses? What's that? Jealousy? Angry? A lot of similarity here, right? What about 1 Kings 21? Would somebody read verse 4 for us? Braden?
And Ahab went into his house, vexed and sullen because of what Naboth the Jezreelite had said to him. For he had said, "I will not give you the inheritance of my fathers." And he lay down on his bed and turned away his face and would eat no food.
This is one that a lot of us as parents laugh at, I think, right? Because we think about our kids behaving like this, and yet we sometimes find adults, maybe sometimes ourselves, doing this, pouting about something. Would you say Ahab could be described as angry because Naboth would not sell his vineyard to him? Yeah, he was vexed, he was sullen, you could say angry or whatever. But the point is, the condition of their heart seems pretty similar. In Esther chapter 3, verses 5 and 6, we're going to read about Haman. Would somebody read these two verses for us?
And when Haman saw that Mordecai did not bow down or pay homage to him, Haman was filled with fury, and he disdained to lay hands on Mordecai alone. So, as they had made known to him the people of Mordecai, Haman sought to destroy all the Jews, people of Mordecai, throughout the whole kingdom of Ahasuerus.
That's right. And so what was the condition of Haman's heart when Mordecai wouldn't bow down to him? What's his emotion? Hatred, anger, fear maybe in some way, right? And he wasn't just going to kill Mordecai. He was so angry he wanted to do what? Wipe out the Jews, kill all of them. So we see a lot of similarity in these Old Testament examples of people who were going to at least be tempted to commit murder and try to commit murder, if not actually doing it, right? So all of this goes back to what Jesus says about anger. He is not just pointing to thou shalt not commit I'm moving forward. Thou shalt not murder, but he is really focused on the condition of one's heart that motivates somebody to commit murder. And so he's going to describe that as anger. We're going to see that he certainly warned about this. And let's go ahead and read verse 22 of Matthew chapter 5. Who would read that for us? Jimmy?
But I say to you that whoever is angry with his brother will be liable to judgment. Whoever insults his brother will be liable to the council, and whoever says he's a fool will be liable to the hells of fire.
So, the old law, the scribes and Pharisees would have looked and said, look, if you commit murder, then what the law of Moses prescribes is the death penalty. Jesus is saying, let's look beyond the action and let's look at the condition of the heart. And what does he say about the condition of the heart? Does that put one in danger of judgment? It does, right? One who's not fulfilling the law of God, one in terms of the way he's thinking. And so we can think about how God gave a similar warning to Cain. What was that warning? See if I have it up here. I don't think I do. Do you remember in Genesis, back over in Genesis chapter 4? Yeah, that's right. Sin's crouching at the door. He said he has the ability. Why are you angry? Why is your face fallen? If you do well, will you not be accepted? And if you do not do well, sin is crouching at the door. Its desire is contrary to you, but you must rule over it. Cain had the choice to make. It was the condition of his heart that was leading him down this path of sin. And God says you have the opportunity to choose a different path. You have the opportunity to choose something that's good. In Psalm 37, verse 8, David writes, refrain from anger and forsake wrath. Fret not yourself. It tends only to evil. David, under the law of Moses, a man living under the law of Moses, he spoke about the importance of not pursuing anger, not letting anger take control of the decisions that you're making. Kendall?
There was an old preacher that said, I like sayings, he said, anger is one letter away from danger.
Okay, that's a good one, yeah. Anger is one letter away from danger. That's good. And that's very true. And Jesus is pointing our attention not only to what the law of Moses prescribed in thou shalt not murder, but what else was said under the law and the prophets regarding what leads to murder. Well, Jesus is really pointing back to that, isn't he? When he says, I say to you, this isn't new information. This is information that these Jews would have known based on what God's law had said. In Ephesians chapter 4, would someone read what's up on the screen, verses 26 and 27?
Be angry and do not sin. Do not let the sun go down in your anger. You have no opportunity to pray.
Be angry, do not sin. Sometimes we turn to this to say, well, hey, it's okay to be angry. And certainly we feel emotions all the time. There are certain things that make me angry. Certain things made Jesus angry. We think about him cleansing the temple. He was angry at times, but it wasn't an anger that led him to sin. When we think about anger, and I would submit to you as we go through the next several verses, we're going to see this application made to various attitudes of the heart. It's really keeping those things under control. Which one of the Beatitudes does that remind you of when you think about keeping something under control? Meekness, right? Meekness. We feel all sorts of things. That's a part of our experience as human beings and really children of God, to have emotion. But we have a responsibility towards those emotions to keep them in check and to maintain control and not let sin have its opportunity over us. Sean?
I would argue that in Ephesians chapter, that the difference between Ephesians 4 and Matthew 5 is that Jesus calls specifically, you hate your anger with your brother.
Okay.
There's the idea that I'm upset with what happened. Let's say I wrong you. You're upset that I wronged you, but your hatred isn't driven towards me. It's driven towards the action that occurred. You still love me.
Okay.
I think that's the difference between the anger and do not sin idea versus hating your brother.
Mm.
Jesus hated the actions that those people did when they sold, they were using the temple for money laundering, right? And he flipped tables, right? Which is certainly righteous anger, but he never hated those people. It's
Right.
impossible for him to hate those people.
Right.
And I think that's the action and the idea of hate the sin, but love the sinner. Right?
Okay.
That's what I would argue for that.
Okay.
is the difference there.
Thank you for that, Stephen.
And it also says, at least in this translation, without cause.
Yep.
And if you think about, Cain, what was the cause of his anger? Did Abel do something to him? No. And I think that's a distinction as well. That it's not as if someone's attacking me or saying, hey, you're making me feel angry. No, this is some guy who's just serving God.
Yeah.
And then his brother's just angry with him without a cause.
Okay. Good point. Good point. Joe?
There's a commentator that refers to anger as the devil's cocaine, in that its addictive nature. He's specifically referencing clickbait on the internet, that it drives the bulk of the internet traffic. And so, just like with the passage that follows on lust, we don't need to go looking for things that feed that habit. There's a lot of things in the world to be angry about, and evil abounds.
Right.
But we should instead meditate on the things that are true and noble, and let the things that we cannot control go past us without them angering us.
Yeah.
There's plenty in your personal life that will make you angry. You don't need to go borrowing other people's anger.
It's true. Yeah. It's really, really good. And so when we go ahead, Heather.
Well, this is kind of a stretch, but I used to read this verse and think about the not letting the sun go down, just in that it's not good for yourself to go to bed angry. You need to make amends with someone because you don't know if you'll have tomorrow, kind of from that standpoint. But now that I'm a little older, I think of it in when the sun goes down is when it's dark. That's when people's thoughts just start to spin out of control. And if you have something that you're upset about or holding on to, that's when I feel like your brain starts to come up with maybe really terrible, crazy ideas, because you're in the darkness and you're just focusing on that. You're not able to fall asleep, and so you're just thinking of bad things, and that's when I think you give that opportunity to the devil. So I think it's more about letting it go
Excuse me.
before it's dark and your
Mine is going somewhere else. Yeah. I've never thought about it that way, but that's an interesting perspective for sure. So let's think about then how Jesus now applies this. So I think we've all come to an agreement about the idea that unrestrained anger is wrong. And as Sean's pointing out, he's really focused on the relationship between people. And it's interesting to me, maybe instead of saying that, I should say, if I were just reading these two verses, verses 21 and 22, and reading Jesus teaching about anger, and I were to think, well, what's Jesus going to say next? I would tend to think he might make a direct application to the person who's angry. But instead, let's read verses 23 through 26. Would somebody mind reading those verses for us? Okay, thank you.
Therefore, if you bring your gift to the altar and there remember that your brother has something against you, leave your gift there before the altar and go your way. First, be reconciled to your brother, and then come and offer your gift. Agree with your adversary quickly while you're on the way with him, lest your adversary deliver you to the judge hand you over to the officer, and you be thrown into prison. Assuredly, I say to you, you will by no means get out of there until you've paid the last penny.
Is there anyone besides me that may be a little surprised that Jesus turns the table a little bit about the person who comes to the altar and thinks, oh, there's a problem out here, my brother's angry with me, I need to go resolve that? For me, that wouldn't be the first application that I would think of based on what Jesus said in the last two verses. But that's what he says. Why do you feel like that's important? What is that? How does that pertain to you today in terms of this topic of unrestrained anger? Go ahead, Caitlin.
I was just going to say, I think
Excuse me.
when you're angry, it's harder for you to think rationally.
Okay.
And the person who is not necessarily angry with you has kind of a better stake in doing that. And so when we think about loving others, it's like stepping up and doing the best for others and putting them first. So even though the other person is angry, you're stepping up and helping them to resolve that, even though it's not you.
Okay. Yeah, you're concerned about the way others are viewing you. Yeah, absolutely. Ben, what are you going to say?
I think about one, the Beatitude about blessed are the meek,
Yep.
for they shall inherit the emphasizing here's an opportunity for you to help that brother to potentially save that brother.
Okay. Yeah.
Since he's in danger, you want to help.
Absolutely. Yeah. Recognize the importance of that for sure. Any other thoughts on that, Chuck?
And then it goes to the later beatitude, talking about blessed are the peacemakers.
Okay.
And then, our responsibility is to, somebody has a problem, you go. It's like somebody you work with, you can tell pretty quickly if somebody, like, is there a problem?
Yeah.
That type, just confront it.
Okay. All right. Very good. Stephen?
Have you thought this might also indicate that this person that's going to the altar, they may be guilty of something?
Mhm.
Maybe they have done something against that brother. There's a reason that they're upset with them.
Yeah.
So you sure don't leave that undone.
Yeah.
It'd be hard for me to figure out how Abel could have done this. There's
Yeah.
nothing he did. He would never even know. Like, I didn't do anything.
Right.
But the brother says, I made him angry.
Yeah.
I did something.
Right.
I remember. I need to make
Yeah.
upset with me. I
Yeah.
need to do something.
That's a really good application for sure. So think,
I was just thinking about what you mentioned too, Stephen. If that brother attacks us or attacks you, and you're like, I haven't done anything, then it's also an indication, oh man, there's something going on with this guy.
Yeah.
Maybe what can I do to potentially help him or to see what's happening?
that's right. Yeah. Very good. So, Cole, did you have something?
I was just gonna ask, like, I feel like this is something that's a hard to apply application just in life, because sometimes we justify anger, like Jesus' anger, or I think about Stephen when he's being, right before he's stoned, like this passage that we're reading talks about them like being, he's like, don't call someone a fool, right? But Stephen essentially calls them fools. He's like, you're stiff-necked people, you don't
Okay.
listen, and then they're like, let's kill him.
Okay.
And I think something that's back to what Sean was saying is that Stephen's being stoned. What does he say at the end? He's like, "Forgive them, for they know not what they do."
Right.
And he was more just like, "Why are you being so stubborn?"
Right.
You know, but it's hard for us in the moment to control that. Like, you have to know yourself really well to be able to control something like that, right?
Yeah.
And have really good intentions to control anger. I feel like, and stay humble at the same time.
Okay.
So.
Yeah. Absolutely.
I don't know. I don't think Stephen would fall into here in verse 22. I think I understand what you're saying. This idea of you good for nothing. This sounds like an attack. This is way bigger than Stephen stating the obvious. That they were just like the prophets of old, or just like the Israelites of old. They were just nothing. What Jesus seems to be emphasizing here with this "be good for nothing, you fool." This is way more vicious in nature. I think what Stephen did is more. What he was saying was truth, number one.
Okay.
Versus this kind of abuse or attack that this language here that we have in verse 22, which also makes me think about the Pharisees. They're angry with Jesus. What are they saying about Jesus? How are they talking about Jesus? Which would fall into this verse as well. And they're in danger. They were in danger of going there.
Can I just ask something to that? So when you say you fool, you're meaning more like it's a specific attack. There's no intent behind it other than, like, I just want to call you a fool to hurt you.
Yeah, I mean, what Stephen was doing, Stephen was convicting their hearts and preaching the truth when he said, you stiff-necked, stubborn people. And we could say, too, inspired by the Holy Spirit and what he's preaching in Acts chapter 7. Here, this is that anger. This is not righteous anger in verse 22. This is something wicked, evil,
Yeah.
hatred, hateful. It's an attack versus, stating that obvious.
This was great. I didn't have to talk for like 2 minutes. That was great. So let's think about all the things that were just said. So Sean said something early on that kind of points us back to the direction that Jesus seems to be taking with this teaching here. And I'll give you a chance in just a second. When we think about Jesus' application, let's remember that Jesus says he came and he's going to fulfill, he's fulfilling the law and the prophets. And remember how we talked about he's really turning attention to the condition of the heart? We're going to see that over and over again in the next few verses. Jesus is turning attention to that when he's talking about fulfillment of the law and the prophets. And then when he's talking about true righteousness, your righteousness must exceed that of the scribes and Pharisees. He's making a comparison to those who were regarded as the religious leaders. They were the religious leaders. And yet Jesus himself, and this kind of goes back to something Cole just said, Jesus himself would call them hypocrites because of the condition of their heart, right? So when we think about that, the priority is really what Jesus is going to emphasize in the next few verses. Now, before I go further, Sean, go ahead.
You can make the comparison with Stephen and how his reaction to the Pharisees, to call them fools, and then at the end, ask for forgiveness for them. That was his true intent. His intent was to save them, right? In the same way that Jesus, who said way worse stuff to the Pharisees, one of the last things he says is, forgive them, for they don't know what they do,
right?
And it was the end of spite to the person versus spite to the action. If someone's doing something really bad, you need to call them out on it and say, oh, it's okay. It's okay. You can do better. No, that was a terrible thing you did. You need to do better, is the idea, right? You hate their actions, but you still love the person. It's a very fine line, and people can still be offended by it, because the Pharisees didn't like Jesus for calling them out, of course, but also it has to be said. You have to be able to say these things, but you also have to be able to love. It's almost this dichotomy of love and respect at the same time. Respect for the person, but love for them, but hateful for the actions because you respect God.
Right. Which goes back to the idea of rebuke. Yes. There is an idea of rebuke that is done in a loving way. Jesus is going to rebuke sinners, but that's a little different. Stephen said something a moment ago we're going to come back to as well. But before we do that, Taylor, go ahead.
I think it also boils down to intention. So throughout all of this, it comes back to the heart of why the person is doing what they're doing. And even from the beginning, talking about the commandments and
right.
everything, Jesus was trying to show them that it wasn't just the words of don't do this, don't do this,
right.
do this. It's why are you doing it? What is the motivation behind your actions of what you're doing? And anger and in other circumstances as well.
Yeah, I agree completely with that, and this takes us back to something Stephen said a few minutes ago. What if I realize, and maybe you can think of this circumstance in your own life, you come, maybe you're here this morning, we're about to go and worship God together, and you start thinking about something that you've done that was not righteous, but you've given someone else a reason to be upset or angry with you. How important should that be? What's the priority that Jesus places on that? Well, what's the priority the scribes and Pharisees seem to place on that? Probably not very high, right? Probably not very high. Jesus says, leave your gift. In other words, that is a super high priority. If I know that there's something that I need to resolve with a brother, I need to make that a super high priority. Is that an easy thing to do necessarily? That can be really hard to do. It can be really hard emotionally to get myself to the point that I'm willing to humble myself and go before someone and just seek to resolve some conflict. And I have complete power to do that. I have complete control over that, but I may not make it a priority because it just seems easy in the moment not to do it or whatever. Unresolved conflict certainly matters to God, and I, at least as I read these verses, that seems to me to be one of the primary points Jesus is making when he says, first be reconciled to your brother and then come and offer your gift. First be reconciled. God cares about the relationship that his followers, kingdom citizens, would have with each other. He puts a priority on that. It has everything to do with our relationship with God. I can't come and sit in the auditorium and be at odds with the person across the auditorium from me and let that persist and think that I'm okay with God and that God's hearing my prayers and accepting the worship I offer. It's got to be a premium, a priority placed on resolving that conflict. Now let's think about situations that we've already alluded to. Let's think about, as somebody mentioned earlier, Cain and Abel. Abel was simply doing what God would have him to do, and Cain became angry because God didn't have as high regard for his offering as he did for Abel's offering. It was completely within Cain's control to control that anger. It wasn't as if Abel had done something wrong, right? It wasn't as if that was the case. So that's a little bit different situation, but here's the point. There are many opportunities where either just because of a misunderstanding or maybe because I've actually done something wrong against someone else, I have the opportunity to resolve that, and I need to be motivated to do it. Now, that may lead us back to thinking about some of these Beatitudes, and we keep alluding to them, but I just want to point a few of them out that at least stand out to me, and you may have others. What does this say about a peacemaker? Is Jesus further teaching about making peace? Or meekness? Or mercy? He certainly is. He's really putting these things, applying these things to how his followers ought to be behaving. It goes back to their attitude of heart. Wade, go ahead.
Thinking about this whole idea of anger, and for a lot of us in here that are parents and grandparents, a place to make this very real to us is in our homes with our kids.
Yeah.
Because my girls, they love each other, they get along great. There's so many times they get angry at each other, and as a parent, you see it, it makes you mad, but then you're trying to teach them at the same time. And I think about when I was young, I was a terrible younger brother to my older sisters. And I think the reason is really because I was just selfish, and I just didn't have control of myself, and just wanted to do what made me feel good
Yeah.
when I was younger.
In the moment.
And so, one, we have to practice it and be the example for them. But two, it's a great place because we think about our brother or people out in the world that have angered us or that are angry with us. But I mean, every day my daughters are getting mad at each other, want to hit each other, or just be mean to each other. And you're like, why are you doing
Every
that?
day. That's tough.
And they don't really have an answer
Right.
necessarily because they just, it just in that moment made me feel good. To
Yeah.
do that to them. Just yesterday, Estella and Viv and Gigi, and Viv come out, and they're like, we didn't do anything. I'm like, okay, well, you may not have done anything. You may not have. I said, but you know what makes her get upset, and she does it really quick. So if you see her getting that way, you have a responsibility to help her. So it's not just, oh, well, we didn't do anything. She's all Stella. Well, no, if you're interacting with her and you see that, you have a responsibility as a sister to try to help her fuse.
Yeah.
So it's a great spot to practice that at home, being the example, and then every day, multiple times a day.
You've got lots of opportunities. That's good.
It's a matter of selfishness versus putting God where he should be
All right.
and others where they should be.
No, I think that's great. It's a really good example of something we have to be teaching our children. And one of the other kind of side lessons here is that when we think about Jesus' teaching as it relates to resolving conflict, can that also prevent bad things from happening to you? Yes, absolutely. That's what he's talking about in these last couple of verses about agreeing with your adversary quickly. You may end up in prison if you don't take care of this, right? There's going to be some potentially really negative things happen if you don't take control of that. I'll tell you what we're going to do, just because we've got like 90 seconds left. I want to think about this next section for a moment and just think about, and there's a checklist. That checklist is really there just more for emphasis than anything else at the beginning of the next lesson. But I want you to think about what Jesus really is pointing the attention of his hearers to. When we start thinking about this idea of commitments, if you read the next section of verses, and maybe you're doing that this coming week, you're thinking about what's Jesus really pointing attention to, and that is that true followers of God, true citizens of the kingdom, have made a commitment to God, and they need to honor that commitment. They've made a commitment to themselves in terms of their own fidelity and their own moral purity, and they need to honor that commitment. They've made a commitment to their spouse and to obeying God's marriage laws. They hopefully have made a commitment to other people in terms of not pursuing their spouse, right? As well as honoring one's own word, being trustworthy. Think about those as you read this next section of verses. We're going to hasten through some of these verses in the interest of trying to catch up a little bit from where I'd hoped we would be. I will tell you this, though. One of the things that I've learned to do is leave myself a cushion. So the last lesson is a review. So we're going to make as much progress as we can, and then that last week, how much review we do kind of depends on how quickly we go through. So I tell you that only because I love the comments you're making, and I don't want to stifle those in any way. Really good. You've added a lot to the class, and I thank you for that. Thank you all for being here this morning.